Maybe I can talk through her then. As long as she's not gonna show her face. Awesome. So we're gonna talk about the masonry a little bit. Oh yeah. Here we go. Women like Walker Marjorie Pierce inspire generations of young women in poverty, globally every day. Her legacy, having worked with some of the greatest like Julia Child and Ronald Reagan, have helped her influence youth like myself. As a toddler watching cartoons and sneaking cookies from the cupboards, Walker's presence extended beyond my ability to comprehend who she was to our oppressed family. A mentor and activist, Walker's "can't fuck with me" spirit became a core part of my identity as I developed into my 20s. Her celebrity, an involved member of the television and film world, an Illuminati. Much of Walker lived through her mottos. The humble life my mother lived as a cleaning woman for Walker and her husband Jack Weatherford changed the direction of my life, often taking along to dust the furniture, change the sheets, and sit for tea with Jack, talking about elements of the world. With a strong following of artists and activists, Walker used her ties to the Illuminati to educate generations and wake up a spirit of feminism, pride, and self-importance. A young child trapped inside a religious cult run by the Masons, Walker was my wake-up call to a larger, more diverse conversation of world political affairs, economics, and eventually psychological warfare. Waking up in my 20s as an activist living on a bench in Washington, D.C., Walker's world began to meld into my own. A Mason on my floor at George Mason University made me curious about concepts practiced inside secret societies and what role they may have played in my childhood. In the center of government territory, I was bound to cross into classified areas eventually, stumbling upon elements of this organization that are kept secret by its members, specifically government experiments having to do with psychology. While researching the Masonry and Illuminati, I was pursued by the local cops, falsely arrested, and put into psych wards where doctors claimed that I had a mental illness, though there was obviously no evidence of one. Tortured internally by the U.S. government for 5 years, they injected illegal psychotic medications to attempt to cause permanent damage to my psychology. Their goal was to affect my ability to function within a healthy frame of mind. Now a hostage in an invisible war. Yep. The body rejecting the drugs, unneeded. I suffered severe side effects, including seizures, inability to walk.
Obviously, the ones by the shore, if you guys want to, but these are the ones that we'd rather get done.
Yeah, let's do this. We can do this. Well, we were planning on.
The body rejecting the drugs, unneeded.
Yeah,
I suffered severe side effects, including seizures, inability to walk, muscle spasms, tremors that shook my entire body continuously, 24 hours, blackouts, a heart attack, loss of speech, no strength to lift even a fork to my mouth, while my brain screamed of pain and pounded with migraines. Knowing that the only way to keep my sanity was to leave the psych ward and come off the drugs naturally, I began to start a riot inside the walls, speaking directly to security cameras. I gave pertinent information, my social security number, and known members of the government who had direct influence in my arrest. When the doctors brought me in for evaluation, I immediately told them I would sue the institution for torture if they did not release me immediately. The nurses began to act as if I had multiple personalities by calling out false names, hoping that I would respond. Each time, they received a glare and silence. Don't you love it when Trump's Secret Service tried to intervene with you? When the nurse entered the room with psychotic drugs, I refused them, telling the staff they were unneeded, and again, I would sue if they were injected, because of the psychological effects of the drugs and permanent damage they would cause. It was apparent that my reality was not altered the way the doctors had claimed. A psychologist myself, schizophrenia should never have been the diagnosis. It was apparent by this diagnosis that I had come very close to government secrets, and the most radical diagnosis was their only option to stopping me from progressing in my fight as an activist and journalist. Outside of the psych ward, my life became a giant game of psychological warfare. Living quarters were grounds for military birds to whistle secret signals to designate my location, while federal agents used hand signals and coded speech to track my daily events. Keeping close eye on research, books, and other materials that would allow me to unveil educated documents that could be decoded and taught to the everyday public. What I found in my research was evidence that my story was more common in this global psychological fight. Psych wards were being used by the government to house activists, journalists, and persons deemed a threat to this conversation about psychological advancement, particularly scientists, with the ability to eventually tap into the fourth dimension, a dimension of thought or psychic ability. The CIA tested me in safe houses on elements of government practices to trace leads that could be erased for further evidence and practices of these psychological concepts of war. Using hidden cameras on telephones and auditory listening devices in watches, agents questioned, tested my intelligence, dug into knowledge about the CIA and FBI, often accusing me of being a terrorist. Attempting to keep me homeless, broke. My computer was hacked internally so that I could not research concepts of global wars, aspects of government, and how they pertain to the psychological affairs on U.S. territory and abroad. Training myself while being attacked daily, I learned to speak like a Fed, picking up conversations, gained insight into the practices and use of spyware by the CIA, surrounded by aspects of military terms like Scorpion, Cockroach, PJs, Recon, Special Operations Teams, and flashlights began to take on a more profound meaning. Black Ops flashlights flickered from police officers across the street, signaling internally to surrounding agents and foot soldiers. Aspects of the everyday begin to have a more complex meaning. A red light in the bathroom to a covert military operation denotes a danger in the facility. The title of a movie, Ocean's 11, is decoded to military water operations or United States Marine or Navy covert operations. Ghostbusters takes on a brand new meaning, the existence of Masonic spirits and psychic ability. Fox and the Hound can be used as a code between the military fox and a police officer or a hound. Brand names completely change purpose. Nikes often worn by U.S. government affiliates and military personnel. Colors such as yellow, red, brown, and black denote military signals and areas of specialty. Black for Black Ops and brown shirts which designate foreign military forces. Fight Club, a movie about one man's battle with the Illuminati inside his head. After the events in Los Angeles, I ran into an old acquaintance from Christ Hustle the Faith, the cult that raised me. His name was Shaka. Ironically, the ex-convict and murderer lived just blocks from St. Joseph's Academy, where me and my 8 siblings grew up. Happenstance? Most likely not. We had a brief conversation while walking the block. Under his breath, he said, "How the fuck did this one escape without being shot?" He thought the words slipped out without being acknowledged, but I heard every one of them. "She's not crazy at all," he said. We spoke for a few minutes longer. Lucky were his final words, though he should have said Lucy. When I woke up at 5, my first memory was nothing like my current circumstances. A small room shared with my sister. She slept on the bed, leaving me with the pull-out trundle on the floor. There was a dresser that sat along a parallel wall with a mirror that filled the space. The blanket that was wrapped around me each night, full of roses, was my grandmother's. It was ugly, greenish, and ragged, but it was our history. We took it to church and laid on it outside while having picnics at our community farm in Hugo, Minnesota. To a child, life isn't violence, politics, and war. It isn't full of coded language, a complex circumstance, or an existential crisis. It's much more simple, full of curiosity and exploration, an educational phase before we age and become part of the war ourselves. 17 was the most difficult part. Sat in Vernon's office, I was victimized and told that my family would never have contact with me again. That was God's will, and great consideration needed to be taken before making such a great leap. Then he preached at me the ways of God for over 2 hours, using fear and biblical terminology to break me. But being a feminist and revolutionary, it only made me angry. Leaving was always the most difficult transition. Not taught financial systems, how to handle money, or having contact with family. Heathens were literally orphans. An orphan of Minnesota, living with an elder sister, I had to transition into an entirely new environment my senior year of high school and learn how to communicate with a new world that was not my own. Luckily, my class had a strong group of geniuses, including a kid who attended West Point, a political affairs guru, an economics enthusiast, and a foreign affairs major. But the transition out took several painstaking years and a trip to college on the East Coast. It was difficult to see how brainwashed and oppressed I had been in my youth until my transition out. You can only see yourself for who you are when you step outside of yourself, when you step outside of who you are and evaluate who you were. At George Mason University, while I unprogrammed or reprogrammed my brain, a kid on the floor introduced me to the concepts of the Mason Society. In the years following it, he enlightened me to practices of this institution inside the cult where I grew up. I began to speak to members who had left the church, including several of my own siblings, and ask about concepts of Masonic teachings that had existed in their lives while inside the church. They told me of secret practices that had been taught to serious members only, those who had dedicated their lives entirely to the Brethren and its leader of indoctrination, Don Olsberry. Masonic rituals, circles of devil worship, psychological speaking through psychic ability. Quote, "It was an odd experience at first. I thought I was crazy. Voices would speak to me inside my head, but then I realized the voices were friends of mine. The voices would only speak when members of the Masonry would use what scientists would call a fourth dimension of thought, to send thoughts along a frequency in the air. My sister later told me this concept was how radios functioned, a psychologist herself." End quote. Second quote, "It's a concept that the government wants to keep secret. The practices of mass psychological warfare using these advances in science would devastate populations globally. But how should scientists stay silent when wars are waged against civilian populations daily without checks and balances?" The classified scientific researcher of these concepts claimed in an intimate interview. Let's get saying, what do you guys think?